So just to, I guess, introduce Bonnie Devine a little bit again, you've done such a beautiful job. For those of you who don't know, Bonnie Devine is a member of Serpent River First Nation, an Anishinaabe Ojibwa territory in the North Shore of Lake Huron. Her work emerges from storytelling and image-making traditions that she witnessed as a child. Her art explores issues of land and environment, treaty and history. She is an artist, curator, writer, and educator. Though formerly educated at the Ontario College of Art and Design and York University, her most enduring learning came from her grandparents who were trappers on the Canadian Shield. Because we're not currently in Bonnie's exhibition, we're going to begin with Bonnie graciously describing that exhibition, though you would have seen a few of the images playing in the slideshow as you entered upstairs and down here, and of course they're in the catalog too.
Can I just speak through this?
Just through this, yeah, that one's just the recording.
Oh, I see. So how many of you here saw that exhibition? Did everybody see it? Okay, well, I'll just quickly describe it then. The process was to try to reflect on the Columbus adventure here in the New World and the motivation of Europeans to find a new world, and to try to reinterpret that conquest through Indigenous eyes. Much has been read, written, explored about Columbus. Much has been said from a European perspective about what this place represents and what it stands for. And I think that the images that we're sitting with in this exhibition really elaborate on that really clearly. It was a place of opportunity and a place of immense wealth. And the colonists, the conquistadors, the explorers got busy immediately to harvest that tremendous opportunity and wealth. And what I was interested in doing was looking at my perspective, my ancestors' perspective, and the millions and millions of people who were living here at that time who did not think of themselves as part of a new world, as part of an opportunity for someone else to come in and grab. And I wanted to think of that in terms of the historical figure of Columbus. So my initial impetus was to go and look for Columbus and talk about who he was and what his motivation was. And out of that came a fairly large body of work. So I made the glass pieces that are in the show. They are intended to be reminiscent of nautical instruments of navigation and observation, so they're like lenses. What I wanted to do was entice people to go and look through those lenses as though they were looking for a new world. But embedded in those glass lenses are images from Indigenous documentation of the time, contemporaneous accounts of the coming of the Spaniards, and also remnants of memorial sculptures and public installations from the European perspective, who saw the movement into North America by these explorers as a heroic action. And so they are celebrating that. And I wanted to talk about that. How do we actually celebrate what is going on here? Is there anything to celebrate? And if so, what can I contribute to that conversation? So the show contains 8 glass pieces that are set up in the space, and Celeste and Finn helped to accommodate the space for that. Along that very back wall, there was this large painting. Matthew asked me about it earlier. It's acrylic on canvas. It's not stretched. It's like a I think of it as a map. I think of it as a pennant, a flag. It's nailed quite casually to the top of the wall. Hi, Carolyn. It's there to kind of anchor the ideas of the exhibition, which were to set up a kind of dualistic lens. So these are like two lenses as well, like the glass pieces, but they're painted. And they are really intended to encompass a kind of binocular view, a bifocal view. In addition to that, there was a
two-channel video.
Thank you. A two-channel video that was composed of images that I took on the voyage that I made to Spain. And in the background of the video, there was a music piece that was composed by my collaborator, David Deleri. And we'll talk about David a little bit more, but David is a musician who came with me to Spain and then wrote a remarkable piece of music to talk about his perspective of the voyages of Columbus.
Great.
Okay. I did it.
In that, I'll just super briefly point out, there were also two drawings that you had just out in the ramps before people entered, which is what you're seeing there. In that tremendous search and tremendous amount of research, it was really a journey, right? You went to Spain 2 times.
Mm-hmm.
And can you talk about why you decided to go to Spain and then go to Spain again? Can you elaborate a little bit on what you found there, and knowing that you just spoke about that?
Well, it's always fun to go to Spain, right? So there was that. I had never been to Spain before. I had been to Europe just a couple of times. As Finn mentioned in my biography, I come from the North Shore of Lake Huron. I grew up on a trapline. My experience of the world for quite a lot of my life was pretty narrow. And it was only when I began to give rein to my artistic desire that I began to grow and understand that there was a larger story at play, and that there were events and people in the world who did not operate the way my grandparents and my parents operated, and that I needed to learn about that and somehow fold that into my experience and my expression as an artist. And when I began thinking about Columbus, I realized that the only way I would get a clear idea of who he was to go to where he came from. He came from Genoa in Italy, and so I went there first. There's a museum, which is the place where he was born, in the city of Genoa. And I went there, and there's a nautical, it's called the Maritime Museum of Italy in the port of Genoa. It's a fascinating place, but it didn't tell me what I was looking for. It didn't provide that flesh and blood experience that I was seeking about Columbus. And so then I decided to go to Spain. I went to Madrid and Cadiz and Sevilla. I looked through the museums, I looked through the maps, and I couldn't find Columbus. I couldn't find that living blood, that desire. I mean, how do you get the courage to set out in a little tiny boat and sail across the ocean? Like, what kind of man was this? So I had to go back a second time, because when I got back from my first trip to Spain, I realized I hadn't really achieved what I wanted to achieve. I went back a second time, And this time I went to a place called Palos de la Frontera, which is on the very southwest corner of Spain. It's on the Rio Tinto. And it was from that little town that Columbus first set sail in 1492. And it was in that little town where he met the priests, the friars, who gave him the knowledge, the navigational knowledge. It's quite close to Portugal, and Portugal was an extremely important site of navigational research at the time. So he learned, some of the ways of the ocean from them. He also got in touch with some very influential clerics, Roman Catholic clerics, who were attached to the King and Queen of Spain and who were able to marshal financial backing for his enterprise. And as I was walking there with David Delary and going through the little town streets and spending time along the river, I suddenly realized that my project wasn't about Columbus at all. It wasn't about this person, because I came to believe that actually Columbus, as we understand him, may never have existed. What is more important, at least to me, is the ethos of the place from which he emerged, the power that that place contains, and the impetus to travel and to seek and to search that is embedded in that part of Spain. And so that's why I went back twice, and that's why I think I will go back a third time. Because what's happened, it's now 2 years since the exhibition opened, and I'm realizing that there is even more work that I need to do there in order to try to understand this dualistic view that came into clarity while I was there. So I hope that answers, but we'll talk more about this.
And in both of those trips, as you mentioned, it was very helpful and beneficial to have David Delary along with you. And then in making the work, that trip for him as well came into play because you commissioned him to make some music to accompany the 2-channel video. Now he's not here today, but I'm wondering if you can describe your rationale and working process when combining musical composition and installation art.
Oh, music, yes. So I think that the question that I was interested in being asked was, how does music work within this kind of environment in a gallery? Oftentimes you go into a gallery and it's quiet, and they try to leave space for you to contemplate. I think that's why galleries are quiet, because they want you to read, and they want you to look, and they want you to think, and they want that kind of engagement that comes with silence. And I was interested in subverting that. I was interested in filling you up with stuff so that you couldn't rest. It's about this notion of discomfort, I think, and Celeste and I spoke a little bit about that. The way that this project that we're on, the project of reconciliation, is unsettling. And this is a really important word, because what it is about is removing you from a comfortable place. And the music is intended to do that. It is intended to transport you away from yourself, away from your own thoughts, away from your ideas and opinions, and to move you into a space of, I would say, extreme discomfort. Now, the music is beautiful, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that too. Yeah, how does beauty inflect this kind of disruption that artists are trying to generate. And for me, having David do an interpretation alongside my own interpretation was another way to bring in this idea of conflict, to the idea of the two lenses, the two views, the two genders. David, of course, is a man, I'm a woman. David is Anishinaabe, he comes from Walpole Island, but he comes from a completely different tradition. It's not visual, it's auditory. And I wanted to have that kind of experience in order to try to inspire the audience to enter into this field of inquiry in the same way that I did. Who is this guy Columbus? What actually happened there? We're all the products of the discovery of North America and South America. But what the impact of that may be almost imperceptible now. You know, it's been so normalized, the trauma of it, the upheaval that it caused, the violence. And I wanted to try to reawaken our awareness, our sensitivity to that violence. And somehow the music was crucial to bring that forward.
I would say from the comments in the guest book that it was quite successful. And yeah, I think, and even actually in speaking to people at the opening, it certainly filled the space with that feeling. And we will be talking about that a bit more later, but just to get back to, in his essay for the catalog, which we are offering for free today.
Oh.
And then Bonnie will happily sign later.
Oh, cool. I didn't know.
John Hampton, who writes an incredible essay in the catalog, calls your trip an inverted reenactment of Columbus's journey. And he goes on to describe where Divine travels to Palos de la Frontera, discovers La Rábida, and claims it for the Anishinaabe people, not with violence, but with the offering of a tobacco tie imbued with intent and purpose. Can you talk about that act of claiming?
Yes, for sure. I didn't realize when I went to Spain that I was actually discovering it, but I was. And I didn't go by ship. I went by plane, and then by train, and then by rented car. But we found ourselves on a waterway, and we found ourselves confronted with the Atlantic Ocean and this patch of land, this outcropping. And it felt like, gee whiz, like David and I looked at each other and said, you know what, we're probably the first Ojibwa people and maybe the first Indigenous people who found our way to this place. It's tiny, it's not on, it's not on the tourist trail. And that felt momentous. It felt like such a gift of coincidence and occurrence, these sorts of things that happen to you, and suddenly you find yourself thinking, holy cow, we are making a path here. We are making a mark here. And it felt like a claiming. When we went, I'll talk about this act of claiming because I think it's very important. We don't really understand, or at least I didn't. You may, and I hope we'll have room at the end for you to voice your own opinions about this. You may not need to feel discovered. You may never have felt in your life as though you had been discovered. But for Indigenous people, for Anishinaabe people, we were literally discovered, and we have been described in that way in innumerable historical texts and poetic texts and pictures and everything. We were always the passive kind of ground that was opened up by these brave, intrepid European explorers. And I felt this tremendous need to overturn that and to say, I can discover you right back. I can put my mark here and take something from you. I can never take from Europe what they took from us. I can never replicate the destruction, and I wouldn't want to, frankly. But what I do want to do is let them know that this was a monstrous act of violence, and that it needs to be responded to. And so that was what I was trying to do. When we went into the little monastery that's called La Rabida, which is in Palos de la Frontera, there's a room at the very top of the monastery that has rows of glass cases around the perimeter of the room. And in the glass cases, there are small boxes. They're all different. They're quite ornate. They're all open. And they all have in front of them little white cards describing the contents of each little box. And in each little box, there is a little handful of earth. And in front of each box is a sign that says, this earth comes from Ecuador, this earth comes from Colombia, this earth comes from Brazil, this earth comes from Mexico. There are dozens of these little boxes. There's one that says, this earth comes from Canada. And when I saw that, in a way that I can't really describe intellectually to you, I felt it in my body. I felt the theft. And of course, David, who was with me at the time, felt it so strongly that I had to help him out of the room and out of the monastery, and we had to sit outside for a while so that he could regain his composure. What I wanted to do in response to that was gather a piece of Spanish earth and bring it back here and put it in a casket and put a sign on it. It says, I took this from Spain and it means I own it now. But something happened that night. I gathered a little piece. I went down into the water and I took it out of the shore, and I wrapped it in a piece of napkin, and I put it in a plastic bag, and I took it back to my hotel room. And that night, a series of very, very disturbing events occurred that woke me right up out in the middle of the night. And I had to take that little bag of earth because I finally discovered, or I thought, these things are happening because I've got this earth in my room. It was a very negative presence. It was a very malevolent presence that entered my room that night, and things were removed from shelves and landed on the floor. Something was removed from the shelf in the bathroom and landed in the toilet. My computer went dead. I was teaching at OCAD at the time, and I was in conversation with a hiring committee that I was on. My computer went dead, and I couldn't make the connection between the Skype conversation I was supposed to have with this committee. My computer lost all its passwords, and I was isolated. This was terrifying to me, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and I had put that little packet of earth on my windowsill in the hotel room. And I was so scared that I went out in my nightgown with that little packet of earth, and I put it in a flower bed that was across the street from the hotel. I woke up David, who was in the room down the hallway, and I said, we have to go back to La Rabida. We have to put that earth back. I made a mistake. It's trying to kill me. I'm laughing now, but I have to tell you that I was trembling then. And David, he's the pragmatist, and And I'm so glad he was with me. He said, we can't drive down there. It was the middle of the night. We'll take it back in the morning. And we did that. We took that piece of earth back. I put it back on the ground. And I retrieved the little tie of tobacco that I had left in its place. David said to me, "Oh, that tie of tobacco will not be there. It is gone with the tide. You'll never be able to get the tobacco that you brought from Canada to replace. You'll never get it back." And yet, when we went there to put the earth back, the little tobacco tie was still there. It had survived the tide. I retrieved the tobacco tie and I put the earth back. And we came home very shortly thereafter, a couple of days later. My act of claiming, my act of retribution failed. And it weighs on me still that I left something there that I shouldn't have. And that's why I need to go back to Spain, because I do need to take that clod of earth. Maybe I need to go with stronger elders. We've thought about this. I've talked to elders in the community about how to do this properly. As I thought, I made a mistake. And what I've been taught by Anishinaabe elders is that I didn't make a mistake. I just wasn't forceful enough. I wasn't angry enough. And I was thinking, wow, how angry do I have to get? Well, apparently, I have to get pretty angry. And maybe I need to bring a contingent of Anishinaabe, Mohawk, Mexican, Incan, Aztecian people to come there and say, we are taking this back. We are bringing it home. Because only by doing that can we actually balance the two views. Can we actually talk about being equals in this world? And can we actually finally begin, after 500 years, a conversation that will balance this injustice? That's what claiming means to me.
In that 2-channel video, we see that tobacco tie a number of times, and at the moment, that's sort of where it makes its presence in the exhibition. And to play with that 2-channel video, that's what the music was commissioned for. And that music was that you commissioned David Delary to do. You asked him to compose a choral work based on the Latin text of the Dudum Sequidum, which is the ratifying document of the 1493 papal bull, the Inter Caetera, commonly known as the Doctrine of Discovery. Can you describe the thinking behind that creative choice and the evolution and presentation of Delary's music, and then we'll play some of it.
Sure. So what I didn't realize when I first went to Spain and first started looking at the voyages of Columbus was the influence of the Roman Catholic Church on Columbus's impetus, and also the financial rewards that were expected, the spiritual rewards that were expected. And this was a kind of revelation to me. I was raised in the Catholic Church. Both my parents were in residential schools, and so Catholic doctrine was deeply implicated in my own understanding of myself as a human being, as a citizen of Canada. But it's different in Spain. The Catholic Church has a much greater influence still there. And when you go into the areas where Columbus was working before he traveled to North America, the evidence of the church's influence and financial backing is enormous. And their expectations of Columbus's voyage were that he would convert all of these souls as if they were a commodity, as if this was riches for them to gather, and that they would gather all these souls. And somehow this was valorous to them. This was their service to their God. So there are plaques all over Palos de la Frontera that declaim Columbus's voyages as this evangelical mission. And Palos de la Frontera actually calls itself the baptismal font of the Americas, and this is written on the wall there. The Pope, Pope John Paul, went to Palos in 1492 on the 500th anniversary of the voyage to bless the little town, and he held a mass in the chapel at Palos, at La Rábida. And that chapel, this is astounding to me even now when I think of it. That chapel the walls are made of gold. The altar is encrusted with gold. This is gold that came from here. This is the plunder. They don't see the gold. I mean, I don't even know what the symbolism of the gold really means. If you dig down deeper, I think you'd have to be Spanish to do that work. But it's clear that the church's idea of what that voyage was is very different from our own. And very shortly after Columbus returned from the New World with accounts of what he had found there, the Pope wrote something called the Inter Caetera, the Doctrine of Discovery, to claim it legitimately in the eyes of God and the King and Queen of Spain and Portugal, to claim it for Spain and Portugal. He drew a line on the map, and he said, this part will be for Portugal, and this part will be for Spain. And the very act of drawing that line on the map made it so. Everything that follows in our history as North Americans and South Americans originates from that document that the Pope wrote in October of 1493. And I said to David, why don't you set the Latin text of the Inter Caetera to music? Wouldn't that be a great idea? Wouldn't that be, a worthy thing to do? And I was thinking, frankly, that he would maybe set it to powwow music, or, I'm sure you're all familiar with the beautiful singing that Indigenous men are capable of doing when they let their throats open and that sound comes out. And I was thinking, maybe this is how it will be. David had a different idea, and this is the beauty of artistic collaboration, is that you don't interfere with his vision. He decided to set it to medieval choral music, to make it into a motet, which is a very specific convention of composition in the European tradition. He wanted it to be for 4 voices. This is also very traditionally European, a bass, a tenor, 2 men, and a soprano and an alto, 2 women. And we went with that. And he created a piece that reverberates with this ecclesiastical tenor, and yet subverts it, because what he did was, as the music progresses through the various cadences of Pope Alexander's text, he bends the notes, and so it gradually becomes scary in a way, frightening and full of pain. So it's brilliant, I think. And when we opened the exhibition, we had the 4 singers who interpreted that piece, clad in ecclesiastical gowns, so they were dressed like in scarlet robes. And they came in and they stood over there and they sang that music. And I still think someday I'm going to ask him to do another version of that music and do it Anishinaabe style, because I think we still need, like, this is what I mean, like the piece isn't finished yet. I'm still working on it, and David is as well. But yeah, that was what we were thinking about with the music, and I'm glad that it worked out the way it did. But I'm also glad that it leaves an opening for further explanation in the future.
I'm just going to play some of that now.
Oh yeah, this is some of David's music. So he wrote this in my studio while I was painting. And I think that is also important, you know? They're singing in Latin.
It does begin by following those rules of beauty in music, right? And harmony.
Yes.
It begins to break those rules, right? And go into those sinister.
That's enough, yeah. So there's a link in the catalog. There is a link in David's essay to this. So you can download this from the internet, and it's about 10 minutes long. And I'm so delighted to have worked with him. Yeah.
Is there a title for this?
It's called the Intercatura Dudum Sequidum. So Intercatura means oh, by the way, which is really, you know. And then the Dudum Sequidum is, and furthermore. So the Intercatura was written in October 1493, barely a year from the time that Columbus arrived back in Spain to say, look, I found this place. By May, the following year, the Dudum Sequidum was published, and it is actually, this is saying, this is now law. This is holy scripture. Yeah, that's what it's called, Intercatura. Okay.
This show that we currently sit in, Grand Theft Terra Firma by, sorry, I'm just gesturing to Celeste because you mentioned it earlier, but you didn't make it, by David Champion and Sandra Shields, actually has the Intercatura.
Yeah, where is it?
So, it's just sort of, it's one of those power objects behind you there. Yes, in the top corner.
On the framed bits along the wall there? Those are the power objects?
Yes.
Okay.
So this exhibition is coming to us from the Reach Gallery in Abbotsford, BC. It's on tour. And it was really designed as a way to completely reframe the narrative of colonialism using the language of video games, and really using the language of quite intentionally violent video games, right? So Grand Theft Auto is one of those notorious games that's just full of awful acts, and then so what they're doing here is positioning that story deeply within that.
I see.
So we've got the players here and all the different avatars. We're sitting in the position actually where a visitor to the gallery could come in and make their own avatar and think about what their role might have been in that story. And then of course, like in any video game, as you're playing a game, you might power yourself up with certain objects that you find.
I see.
So the Intercaetera, in the context of this exhibition, becomes one of those integral power objects.
Oh, wow.
And,
Okay.
And so when we were thinking about launching this catalog, which, yes, is long after the exhibition, but certainly still relevant as the exhibition just returned from Cambridge and is going to Saskatoon soon this summer. And then we'll return to Ontario for another number of venues. It continues, and absolutely it continues to evolve. You continue to think about it, you continue potentially even to add to it. So we were excited to pair the launch of this catalog and felt it appropriate to do so within this exhibition, knowing that there were these resonances. And Bonnie, that text of the Intercaetera obviously figures so strongly into your show that we even actually decided to include it in the catalog. And of course, its words are throughout the entire exhibition. It was mounted on the wall. Can you talk about the doctrine of discovery and its continuing historical and political influence? And I'm wondering, we invite you to contrast your use of the Intercaetera with David and Sandra's as well.
Oh yeah, no, when I did read that it was a power object here, and I didn't understand. It was in this context, and this is power, of course. The doctrine of discovery has been the basis of the notion of go west, young man. Go into the interior of North America and find what you need. It is the basis of the Marshall Plan. It's the basis of the Mason-Dixon line. It's the basis of Manifest Destiny, which is the underlying philosophy that allows the United States to claim itself as, a dominant force in world politics. It's the basis of European colonialism. It's been used to justify Darwinian theories of the supremacy of certain races over other races. It is deeply, deeply embedded in the Christian ethos that still obtains in our parliament in Canada. And so for me, yes, it's a power object, but it's not like that. And I think this is very interesting. We see the Intercaetera as blasphemous on so many levels. A sin against humanity, a sin against land, a defilement of our true relation to water, to trees, to air. This idea that a human being or a group of human beings can actually claim to own the air and package it and sell it back to us, own the water and package it and sell it back to us, own land, by drawing a grid on a map and taking money from you and then selling you that land. These are concepts that, if we remove ourselves from the context of that doctrine of discovery, become absurd. And so, I was and I still am. I mean, I can feel it rising in me as I begin to talk about these matters, that this is something that I am still deeply engaged in troubling, unsettling, deciphering, and parsing out, finding the faults in the grammar, finding the faults in the philosophical underpinnings and pointing them out, even if that makes me a pain in the ass. I'm prepared in a way that, it's interesting, we're talking about transformation. Part of the transformation is that Native people aren't going to be so nice anymore. There is a time now for us to begin to assume our true role in this country, our true role as interlocutors in the nation building that we need to do. And I feel like maybe the doctrine of discovery, in some very peculiar inversion, has become a power object for me. I can use it in order to articulate some of the rage that I feel, and reflect it back in the same way that those lenses were intended to reflect back or illuminate some of the truth of our existential being here in North America.
Thank you. We're looking at a slide that does have in it the large painting. I'm wondering if you can talk about that large painting, Saturn's Rock La Rabida, that dominated the exhibition, and the symbolism it contains. I'll find a close-up shot.
Okay,
so
that'd be great. Yeah.
And in John Hampton's essay Reverberations, he notes the presence of the cosmos in the painting and also throughout the exhibition, the relationship between the moon and the glass sculptures, the returning and inverted presence of the sun and the moon in the video, and the constellations that border the upper and lower edges of the painting. Can you talk about the importance of these in your work?
Yeah, for sure. While I was doing the research for the Columbus Project, I began to be influenced by some Kabbalistic writings that I came across under the influence of an exceptional Jewish scholar, Annette Poisner. And she directed me to Genesis. And Genesis talks about the way that the world was created, and it's a story we all know. God created the heaven, and it's dualistic. I don't need to go through all of the text of it, but man and woman, sun and moon, earth and sky, the division between the two being quite separate, as if these two entities form part of a whole and yet are separate. And of course, embedded in that dualism is also a hierarchical structure. So the idea is that the sun is greater than the moon, the man is greater than the woman, the sky and the earth are somehow in a similar hierarchical relationship, with the earth being lower than the sky being the dominant figure. And I was really interested in that because in my Anishinaabe teachings, we're taught a more basic and fundamental equivalency. So the man and the woman are both necessary and equal. And you cannot have life without both of them. The sun and the moon, the sun is the grandfather, the moon is the grandmother, and they both bring absolutely essential elements to our understanding of ourselves and the configuration of our world. The water and the land are equal. You can't have one without the other. And where does man or mankind fit within this great kind of wonderful universe of ours? Not at the top. In scripture, in the Judaic tradition and also in the Christian tradition, I hazard to say, although I don't know so specifically, but I hazard to say that in Islam it's the same. Man was given dominion over all the animals and over all the lands, and he was allowed to go and name them. And by naming them, he took ownership of them. Well, we don't have that tradition in our indigenous worldview. We're actually quite low down on the hierarchical scale. We are nowhere near the top. There are many, many animals that are, walking around in Peterborough today who are actually more spiritually worthy than we are, who are wiser than we are, and who are our elders. And we address them in that way. And I was interested in how this cosmology has been mapped by Europe. And I was interested in using that mapping that the Europeans have used in order to talk about their concept of what the cosmos is, to talk about what it meant when Europeans came here to North America and claimed it for themselves. And so on the left side, you see the moon. It's the white part. And inside of that moon, there is a woman. And she is the maiden. And she's from a mummy that was found in 1999 in the Andes Mountains. She was, we don't know how it is that she came to die. Anthropologists and archaeologists say that she was likely sacrificed. I don't know that this is true, but nevertheless, her body now lies in a museum, in a glass case, in the Andes in Argentina. And for me, she represents North and South America, the New World. On the left, we see the sun. And in the sun is an image of Ponce de Leon. And Ponce de Leon was the discoverer of Florida. He was the one who was seeking the fountain of youth. He was, of course, a Spanish conquistador, so he is dressed in full armor, and he is gesturing. This is taken from a monument that stands in St. Augustine, Florida, that is dedicated to Ponce de Leon. And I wanted to talk about this, this idea that the sun, the masculine energy, has everything going for it and will always prevail. And in fact, that the balance of the earth depends on that. In Christian doctrine, it depends on the dominance of the sun. And that the balance actually is an imbalance. And that this imbalance must be maintained. Regardless of rational thought, regardless of humanistic kindness, regardless of what we see actually happening on the ground, we must fight for this. And we see it enacted every day in our parliament, in the House, in the Buckingham Palace, in the church. And I wanted to talk about that, and that's why I invoked the sun and the moon. I invoked the skies, the stars, so they're constellations around the edges of the drawing. And these were the constellations that were in the heavens on the day that I discovered La Rábida in Spain back in April of 2016. And curiously enough, those are the same constellations that Columbus would have seen in the sky when he departed. And they were the same constellations that John Hampton, who is the critic and curator who wrote one of the essays in the catalog, saw in his sky when he was writing. And so I felt like if there is something true, because I don't believe that this misshapen notion of equity or balance, this dysfunctional, diseased theory can't hold, but the stars may provide us with some kind of stability, some kind of notion that there is something beyond us that we can look to, beyond our own flawed conceptions of of what the natural order really is. In the center of the painting, there's a depiction of La Rábida, and I came to believe, actually, that La Rábida was functioning as a kind of fulcrum for the energy that was flowing out of the West and coming here. I believe that because of the history of that place and some of the very dark traditions of that rock there on the Rio Tinto. It has gone through a number of incarnations over many, many thousands of years, right back to Phoenician times, so pre-Christian times. This was a temple to a very dark lord. He was called Saturn by the Romans. Before that, there was a female goddess who was called Persephone. It is a gate to the underworld. And I believe that that is what I felt when I went there, and I believe that that was the force that was operating in my hotel room that night, and I believe that it is the force that continues to disturb me as I move forward in this work. So La Rábida is at the center and is directing the energy from the west to the east. I believe this must be stopped.
Suzanne Morissette wrote about La Rábida. It's not in the catalog, but she wrote an essay called An Appeal to European Aesthetics, which was her doctoral dissertation. In it, she discusses your strategic use of aesthetics, of the aesthetics of 15th century Europe. Can you discuss your use of European imagery in La Rábida, and also can you talk about your use of indigenous imagery?
Yeah. I think that in the glass pieces, this is most evident. So the glass pieces are replications of European insignia, seals. There's a seal of the little town of
Whitesboro, New York.
Thank you, Whitesboro, New York, which is it's a really shocking little decal that they put on their, baseball caps and on their jackets, and I guess it's in their city hall. And it's a depiction of a white settler throttling an Oneida man. And in the original depiction, the Oneida guy is kind of being forced on his back onto the ground. And the white settler is prevailing. And this is precisely the relationship that we see explicated over and over and over again in our major symbols. When it was brought to their attention, I guess in 2007, I can't remember when, very recently, it was brought to the town's attention that this might not be a really politically proper or correct depiction of the town, and maybe they wanted to reconsider. And they took it to a plebiscite. They had a referendum in the town to say, would you like to change this emblem that we have? And they voted to keep it. They said, no, we won this by, force of conquest, and it's ours, and we're pleased with it. So anyway, I turned it into a glass piece. This is, I think that this is European appeals to balance and order and good government. And it has been the basis of how much of the land has been taken here in North America. But there are other depictions in these pieces that come from older European expressions, visual expressions. So some of it comes from Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a Spanish historian, and you may know him, but he wrote a critique of Columbus's atrocities in the West Indies. And there are engravings that illustrated his history by De Bray, who was a Dutch artist of the 1500s. And he depicted some of the violence and murder that occurred in the West Indies, and I translated those also into glass. In terms of the indigenous imagery, there are contemporaneous accounts, and we don't get to hear them. very often, but there are contemporaneous indigenous accounts of the conquest that were written in 1510, 1580, and 1610 by Aztec chroniclers and by Incan chroniclers. And I'm thinking particularly of, I'm going to forget his name, Poma, Guaman Poma. Guaman Poma, oh my God. You know, when I was doing my research and I started to discover some of these old documents, Guaman Poma wrote a 1,400-page letter to the King of Spain in 1570. So this would have been 60 years after the Spanish arrived in the Andes and laid waste to the Incan Empire. He wrote a letter to the King of Spain to complain about the way that the Spanish settlers were treating the indigenous people. These were kings. You know, the Incans had technology that Spain had never seen before. And yet here they were being forced into servitude, working in mines, being beaten in the streets. He wrote this letter. He thought it would be a couple of pages long. It ends up being 1,400 pages long. It includes 400 illustrations and a long text. It is one of the earliest and most complete histories of the Incan people that exists in literature today, and it is available online. It has been held by the Danish Royal Library in Copenhagen for the last 300 years. It's only emerged recently. In the last 50 years, it has been opened to the public. And so suddenly, people who thought, oh, those Native people, they didn't have no history, they didn't have, excuse me if I start talking like a res lady, I get mad. They didn't have any history, they didn't have any written account, they didn't have the mental acuity, they didn't have the intelligence to be able to record their own history. And yet here is this document from 1570 that lays out really, really clearly exactly what went on in Peru. So I took a page from that and turned it into glass and provided the link so that people can go and look at that document. It's very, very important that we understand that there are accounts and that those accounts portray a different story. I guess that's it.
And that those accounts were given to the Spanish,
yes.
You know, and they had them.
Yes.
They knew, right? And continue.
Mm-hmm.
John Hampton wrote, there is a danger to faith and beauty. What is the strategic role of beauty in La Maquina? Yeah,
beauty. And I think that, you know, I come from an art school. My former dean is here, and I feel a little bit nervous about talking about this. Of course, as an artist, we learn about beauty, and I'm, you know, we use beauty in our work in order to attract attention and sustain focus. So, you know, the red coat, these beautiful depictions. We'll find the one that appeals to us most, and we'll go and kind of identify with it, form a bond with it. And for me, because this was such difficult knowledge, it was really important for me that I find a way to present this, that I would hold the viewer's attention long enough that they would be able to maybe get some sense of what I was trying to say. And I was also aware that much of what I was directing my message to, many of those people were not Indigenous people, and that I needed to appeal to their love of aesthetics. And so I used that as a way in. I'm really aware that a lot of this gets tiresome. It sounds like we're whining. I hear a complaint, kind of thinly veiled, quite often. There is a fatigue in the Canadian population, in the North American population, for hearing the sad story of the Indigenous people. And people want to move on. I don't know how many times you've heard it, but I've heard it a lot, where people just say, well, get over it and let us move on, and let's just get to the work of rebuilding. And why are you always going back and kind of regurgitating these old stories from the past? And it is leveled at us as a kind of way of silencing our voices, but also I think there's a certain practicality to this, which is like, let's just get on with the business of it. And so I try to mobilize beauty in my own project of making people stop. Just stop for a minute and look at this and take it in. Because I think it's so easy, and I'm guilty of it too, of just getting impatient with it and just wanting to, let's just fix it. Let's just make it better. I don't think we can make it better if we do not spend time understanding what the roots of the problem are. This is the first part of the truth and reconciliation process. I don't believe that we can adequately reconcile one another as settlers and Indigenous people unless we completely understand and share our deep regret and shame over the past. And this is going to cause pain to settler people in particular, because it's very difficult to grok. But I think that it's essential. And so beauty was for me the way to create a pause, a contemplative pause. And that's what I'm trying to advocate for.
I go to the inner places.
Oh.
I go to the source. I go to the house of invention. Bonnie, your catalog essay, which was co-authored by yourself and Deb O'Rourke, Into Darkness, Into Light, A Journey Retraced, uses this quote as its foundation and introduction. Can you talk about why Norval Morris's words resonated with you and how they influenced your work in La Rabida?
For sure. Morisot talks about the house of invention, and he uses this metaphor as a way of describing the place where his work comes from. And for me, as a contemporary Anishinaabe working in this place, like I work in Toronto. I've lived in Toronto since I was 11. I taught in the academy in the university for 10 years. Many of those years, I was the only Indigenous person in the whole institution. In teaching, there were students, but I was the only teacher. So I've been immersed in Western methodology and Western philosophy my whole life. And the only way that I could find this kind of truth was in my imagination, in the house of invention. And I have always been aware that Western Academy will discount that kind of knowledge, just out of hand. It's not proved. There's no writing to back it up. There's no scientific evidence. We don't have a record. How do you know? And what I believe, and Norval Morrisot taught me this in that quote, was that I can claim to know. This is really hard for me to say because I am an academic, and I value that kind of methodology, but I have got to bring in this deeper way of knowing, and I have got to lift it up so that it can be, it can reach an equivalence. This is the moon and the sun again. This is the female and the male. This is talking about intuitive awareness, body memory, cellular knowledge, deep, deep knowing that does not depend on what some man in some office wrote and put a stamp on, some pope declared and then had it come forward as though this was the truth and this is the law. And so for me, that house of invention, this is where all of us need to go, because we need to rebuild. I believe we have to do this ecologically. You know, when I hear about the mass extinctions that we're facing, when I see, you know, the water walkers are going around the lake right now, the Rice Lake, they are dealing on a different level than the scientific method. They are dealing on love and care and concern, dreams and intuitions. And I believe that this is what we need now to bring back that balance. So that's why Morisot was so important in this work, because he was the one who first laid that down and said, I go there and it feeds me and it tells me what is true. And yeah, good enough for me.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.
You're welcome.